One of the most common questions I get from my book, actually, is in my book, I talk about how to move toward thought. And one of the most common questions I get is how to do that. How do you move toward thought? What does that mean? Or the question, if I'm disidentifying from thought, or I'm recognizing a thought as a thought, then I feel like I'm distancing myself from thought. I'm pulling back from it, making an object of thought, or more of an object of thought. So from that standpoint, how do I move closer to thought? So the way I think makes the most sense to understand this is that disidentifying from thought, which is critical for awakening, critical for becoming more self-aware, critical for becoming more mindful, critical for investigating the nature of suffering, critical for coming into contact with that which we've avoided and repressed. It does so many things. But how do we do it? Well, disidentifying from thoughts requires a sort of two-step approach, generally. The first step is simply becoming aware of thoughts as such, realizing how many thoughts we actually do have. As I've said before, many people are so identified with thoughts, they don't realize they're having them. Or any of us can relate to times where we're so lost in our mind that we don't even realize that it's just thought after thought after thought after thought. We are thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future, we're planning, we're imagining, we're preparing, we're hesitating, we're fantasizing, like on and on and on and on, right? When that's happening, we're in that moment, at least, certainly not aware of thoughts as such. We are sort of hypnotized by the thoughts. We're kind of hypnotized by the story the thoughts are telling. The analogy of a movie screen and a projector are pretty good, or is pretty good. And that is, if you imagine watching a movie on a screen and you're so engulfed in the movie and the story, the narrative, the characters, that you forget for a time that you're not actually in that movie. You're in a theater or in a chair looking up at a screen, and there's a projector behind you projecting a bunch of light onto the screen, and that the images and storylines and narratives and people in the screen don't actually exist at all. They're really just light, right? It's like an effect, and that effect requires you to be a certain distance from the screen to understand the symbols of that light and the sound, and to reconstruct that inside your mind to believe in it. But we can be so identified that we actually forget that is just a bunch of light, that's not actually happening in any way at all. That's to be completely identified, right? Now we can do this with thoughts to a tremendous degree, to a degree that we're often just completely oblivious of. As we start to become aware, as we start to wake up or engage this process of first mindfulness and maybe meditation, introspection, and so forth, we are often taken aback by how much thought actually goes on, how much we're actually carried away from this moment by thought, how much we daydream, how much we mind wander, and actually how we can't control that. How if we actually stop and really try to stay present through a kind of will, it's really challenging, actually, especially at first, right? So anyone watching this video probably knows that, has gone through that phase of things. Maybe not everybody, but that's an important phase, and that's when we start to become aware of thoughts, which is the first step of disidentifying. Now, just becoming aware of how common thoughts are and how pervasive they are and how sneaky they are is not the full scope of the first step, because that will become a practice. That will become a tool that you can use in a more precise way, in a more concentrated way. This I might call meditation and or inquiry. I think when it's used the most precisely, I would call it inquiry. Even though when we talk about inquiry, sometimes, not always, we talk about it as self-inquiry or inquiring into the nature of who you are. I would argue that what you're really doing is you're investigating the nature of thought itself, right? What you're looking into is, well, if all of this time when I was thinking about myself and my past and future and other people, and I was always looking through the lens of thought. In fact, I can't have a perception of me without thought. Well, then who the heck am I? What's actually going on here when I don't reference a thought at all? That's really what we're looking at when we inquire, isn't it? Now, there are different ways to do that, but that's a very potent, precise way to use this instrument of disidentifying from thoughts or becoming aware of thoughts as such, and becoming aware of what is not a thought, or becoming aware of what is primary to thought fundamentally, which is consciousness. But it's one thing to learn about consciousness as a concept. It's another thing to experience consciousness as a primary experience. Quite another thing. Now, you can have tastes of that listening to this kind of a talk, or maybe with a psychedelic experience, or randomly for no particular reason, maybe a strong emotional experience, maybe even an intense loss or something like that can like push you to the extreme of experience, such that you stop grasping to thought to define your experience, and you have this experience of expansiveness or clarity or interconnectedness, love. These are pretastes of awakening, as I describe sometimes. What these are is when you're realizing, oh, wow, there is something primary to any given thought. There's something primary to any piece of this narrative about myself. The narratives themselves are really just thoughts. They're images on that screen, but there's something so primary to that awakeness, that aliveness, that beingness or knowingness, which is something like the light of the projector, right? It's just there. It's just clear, bright, luminous, and it contains everything. It contains everything you've ever thought, every imagined place you've ever been. It's all contained within that, right? And it's primary to it. And when we realize that, we call that an awakening, or I call it an awakening, when it's very thorough and something about what you take yourself to be has fundamentally changed. So in there somewhere, there is a transition point between becoming aware of thoughts as such, like one by one. Oh, there was a thought. There was another thought. There was another thought. And the transition point is between that, where you become clear enough about what a thought is that you can kind of do that automatically. Especially, this may not be ongoing throughout the day, but especially during meditative practice, you will get to this place where you don't have to kind of overtly recognize one thought after another after another. You get the feel of not grabbing onto the next thought. You get the feel of not identifying with the next thought, even if there is a thought. So a thought can appear, but you're not like jumping on the train. You're not getting on the train of thought. You're not suddenly forgetting you're in the theater again, right? You're just aware of the thought stream. And that is when you can now move toward thought, right? The fear often is, well, if I don't keep disidentifying, if I don't keep labeling thoughts and pulling back from thoughts and turning thoughts into an object and visualizing thoughts as the stream or something, the fear is if I don't keep doing that, I'll just re-identify. I'll just find myself in a thought stream. Well, the key difference is that at some point, as I just mentioned, you will have instinctually processed, digested, and just become able to recognize what it feels like to not re-identify with thoughts in the moment. Now, this is a bit fragile, this ability, especially at first. it probably will only happen with concentrated meditation or concentrated inquiry during meditation, meaning while you're engaged in various tasks and walking around talking with people and so forth, it may not be so obvious. It probably won't at first. It may at some point when it sort of catches on fire, this whole process. But at first, it's probably just when you're really sitting concentrated and orienting toward thought, looking at thought, paying attention to thought, paying attention to what's going on inside consciousness. This is when you're going to start to notice when you're identifying with thought subtly and when you're not identifying with thought, right? And you have to find that balance between, as I said in the book, relaxation and intention. The intention is to not become identified or re-identified. The intention is to recognize thoughts, but the relaxation and then becomes surrender is realizing that that's not actually a doing. Not re-identifying is not a doing. Identifying is a doing. It's just that you've been doing it for so long, it's a habit. So once you've worked at breaking that habit long enough, you can stay in that place of, it's a subtle thing, but it's an important thing. You stay in that place of a kind of relaxation where you just don't grab a thought. Now you find yourself in this kind of spaciousness, and you will naturally move toward thought now. Although thought and consciousness now are in a continuum. And that's the key, that there's no reason to make distance. There's no need to pull back, so to speak. The pulling back started happening many, many years ago. It didn't start happening with inquiry. That's what we misunderstand. It's just that we utilize that pulling back in a very focused way to disidentify from thoughts, right? So the pulling back now will start to correct itself. That's that early, like something we learned early in life, right? It's a very early processing habit that we got into. Now we're reversing that, actually. That's what it means to move toward thought. So now we stay in that relaxed place where we know through sort of practice and in an intuition and discernment now, we know we're not re-identifying with thought. And now we can, and it will kind of happen naturally, we can kind of move toward thought. We can move toward that luminous substance that made us think that there was anything there outside of this to begin with, right? It's like now we can look at the screen and see the light on the screen and go, whoa, what is the light? It's just light. In my book, I describe this as walking closer to the screen suddenly and going, wait, what is all this light? I think we've all had that time as a child. Well, maybe I was just a weirdo, but I imagine many people have. Walking up to the old TV screens, the cathode ray tubes that have the little red, green, and blue, almost, they're not LEDs, but they look like LEDs in the screen, like really, really close, where you're sticking your eye up against it and you see the colors, and you realize like there's no picture there. It's just a bunch of tiny little colors. So it's something like that where you become curious about the medium of consciousness, right? Which is the light of the projector, so to speak. And you can get closer and notice it's just light, right? It may be taking shape and moving and forming, but only from a certain distance, which is the distance of identification, does it turn into a story and a narrative. From the distance you are now, which is one of curiosity and relaxation and just not trying to turn it into a story and identify with it, it's just light. And at some point you turn and look into the projector, right? You turn back and you look directly into the source of consciousness, into the source of thought. That you could kind of call awakening in this analogy, because you just become so curious that you just immerse yourself in it. You really let go into it. Usually you'll cross some kind of fear barrier before you do that. And the fear barrier is really just the fear of actually letting go of thoughts for a period of time, because we haven't done it in so many years. Hopefully that's clarifying a bit. It's a subtle thing I'm talking about here, and this is why I think a lot of people still ask questions about it. But once you really start getting this at different levels, it's really powerful. It's very powerful at the level of pre-awakening for sure, but even later on, to get the nuances of this down can be really helpful for your practice, calming the mind, settling the mind, and then settling the body and spirit. Of course, that follows very naturally.